been fighting for democracy in Belarus. We look to your model with great appreciation and hope that we can do everything possible to support it. I would like to begin with you, Mr. Karatonov, because in your written testimony, you talked about U.S. tech companies being used to promote misinformation and hate speech. Can you expand a little bit on that and talk about what the impact of that is in Belarus?
Sure. The so-called state-owned media are using companies like YouTube to promote their content. So they are replicating the recordings that are being broadcasted on broadcast television and turn them into digital media files that are being promoted, let's say, in the form of advertising on YouTube or in the form of regular videos on YouTube. These are the programs that include the so-called testimonies of the victims of arrests. However, as my colleague Sergei Zikratsky will probably support, these are not arrests because arrest has specific legal requirements and specific procedures which are not being followed in Belarus, and we may effectively speak about the enforced abduction of people, and these kind of recordings can be treated as torture and inhuman treatment of civilians. These kind of videos are being promoted by state television on YouTube. They are being used as advertising by certain channels related to the office of Alexander Lukashenko. And in my opinion, these channels, as well as all accounts of the so-called state media and propagandists, both in Belarus and those individuals and companies in Russia who were involved in the operation between August 2020 and December 2020, must be entirely removed from YouTube and be banned for an unlimited period of time in order to prevent the promotion of these materials and the use of these materials as a part of psychological operation. When I'm referring to this term, I mean the psychological operation in the reading of the term, which is widely being recognized by, let's say, the United States military or the Ministry of Defense. So in that sense, the television foremost, there are certain examples in print media, but foremost the television and related websites are being used to intimidate civilians and create the atmosphere of fear, which is coordinated in part with the state security and the units that are more similar to mercenaries rather than state organizations or state security organizations under the Constitution of Belarus and within the international legislation.
That particularly caught my attention because we just saw in Russia during their election the pressure that was put on Google and Apple to take down an app that was created by opposition leader Navalny. And I guess the question I have is, should we be thinking about action in the United States to address our U.S. tech companies that are really allowing that kind of oppression to go on? And I guess my question for you, David Kramer, because you talked in your remarks about the need for us to sanction those businesses that have promoted what's happened in Belarus and enabled Lukashenko. Is this something that you think we ought to be thinking about in the U.S. to be able to take action against those tech companies that are enabling Lukashenko, Putin, other autocratic leaders to oppress the rights of their people?
Senator Shaheen, thank you for the question. I think I would draw a distinction between companies that follow what are deemed to be local or national laws or rules or orders coming from places like Russia and Belarus, and those companies that are actually providing financial support to such regimes. I think technology companies that facilitate the repression by taking down apps that authoritarian regimes don't like need to understand that they are playing into the hands of the authoritarian regimes and are doing a disservice not only to the people in these countries, but to the cause of freedom. For those companies, however, that are actually funding regimes like Lukashenko's or Putin's, then I think the need for sanctions is in order, because they would be in violation of sanctions we have put in place against a regime like Lukashenko's.
Well, thank you for that distinction. I'm not sure I totally agree with it, but it does help me better understand exactly what you were saying. Can I ask, when earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit Lithuania and meet with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and hear very directly from her what was happening in Belarus. And we also visited Ukraine and Georgia with a congressional delegation. And it was about that time that Putin was talking about entering a union with Belarus and also adding, there was some question about whether he was interested in including Crimea in that union, and of course the provinces in Georgia that Russia has invaded. I wonder if those of you who are here testifying have any perspective on whether this proposed union is really going to happen, and if it did, what the impact on Belarus would be. And I will ask you to go first,
Right, thank
Mr.
you for your questions.
Kurtonov, but also if the other witnesses would speak to that as well.
Whenever we speak of this union, we have to realize that the work of this union started in late 90s, and many of the aspects that were discussed back then, for instance, the common currency, was supposed to appear in 2005, 15 years ago, 16 years ago today. So I must admit that the work of the so-called union state is being slowed down by both sides, since both sides are having their own advantages from having this process as a process rather than a result. However, for Alexander Lukashenko, establishing a full-fledged union with Russia would mean the end of his career and the end of his control over the country, mainly because of the power that Russia still has, but also because of his functionality that will be definitely limited, if not legally, then de facto. So for him to establish a real union with Russia would be the political death. However, the Russians are still interested in establishing this union, foremost because of the military facilities that Belarus can provide, because of Russian military presence that actually was upgraded just a few weeks ago when Russia delivered S-400 missile rocket launchers to the border with Poland and Lithuania in the western side of Belarus. So although they are speaking about the so-called training center or training military center, we may say that these are the Russian forces, these are Russian military facilities that were deployed to the territory of Belarus. There's also aircrafts that were delivered to central Belarus. So it's a very touchy issue. However, it is clear that if only such union is a full-fledged reality, it would mean the end of the sovereignty for the Republic of Belarus. And we may speak of the construction that would be politically similar to the role of Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic in the USSR, which means all decisions, all military capacity, all financial roles would be controlled from the Kremlin, and Belarus will only be the proxy, and the politicians in Minsk would be the proxies of the Kremlin. So this is indeed something that has to be avoided. And in order to prevent this development of events, Lukashenko has to be removed from power, because he's essentially the only politician who was promoting this union in Belarus, and he's actually the most pro-Russian politician to a certain extent, which, however, does not jeopardize his own personal rule, and his personal rule is the supreme authority, is the supreme value for himself in terms of politics. Whenever he speaks about the control of sovereignty or maintaining of sovereignty or strengthening the sovereignty, he speaks about his personal control of the country for which he has no legitimate or legal rights, and he acts in private capacity, which is as well recognized by the U.S. government.
Let me thank you for that response. I think that was a pretty comprehensive response. I'm going